Today's topic, male gender bias in the nursing profession. What is the reason that men who make up 50% of the population have such a low participation rate in nursing presently, as well as when you go back? I drew some statistics. 1% of nurses back in the 50s and 60s were men, 2.7% by 1970, 4.1 by 1980, 5.7 by the 90s, 7.6 by 2000, and the current statistic, right around 10%. The short answer, intentional, blatant, and institutional gender bias against men in the nursing profession, beginning with the modern reforms ushered in by Florence Nightingale. What are the ongoing barriers that continue to persist in nursing education, as well as in the larger nursing culture, that may contribute to some ongoing bias of men as nurses? Will be the topic of today's video. But would it surprise you that men have not always been such a minority as caregivers? For example, back in the ancient era, back in ancient Greece, 400 to 600 BC, men were the dominant caregivers in the hospitals and systems in Greece, where Hippocrates, at the infancy of modern medicine. In ancient Rome, in the 4th century BC, men were referred to as nosocomi, the male caregivers who took care of the wounded Roman soldiers. But they did not do their job well, because we have something named after their legacy, nosocomial infections. And if you know what that means, it's not good. Bottom line is, early Christian church in the AD era, men were the dominant caregivers. Is it interesting to note that even in the example that Jesus used of the parable of the Good Samaritan, it was a male who was a caregiver and wounded and took care of this wounded man in the ditch. In the early centuries following the AD era, you have monastery orders, you have military knight orders in the military of ancient medieval times in Europe. And this continued all until about the 15th to 16th century. But then something changed. The modern era was initiated, and Florence Nightingale, the patron saint, and someone I dearly appreciate for all she contributed, said this: men's hard and horny hands were not fit to touch, bathe, and dress wounded limbs, however gentle their hearts may be. And she also went on to say this: men have no place in nursing except where their physical strength was required. Now, back in the 1860s, where was male strength required? The insane asylums before antipsychotics. And that's where men were relegated to in the modern era with Florence Nightingale. She had a viewpoint that every woman was a nurse. That is in Notes in Nursing, and that women were just doing what came naturally. She did not feel the same about men. So what were the consequences in England at this time? Well, men were refused admission to the Nightingale School of Nursing, were excluded from general nursing practice, and again relegated to the insane asylums. And if a male caregiver wanted to do more, he was considered a pervert and threatened with expulsion. Well, were things any better when you look at England as things continued? Men made up less than 0.04 of 1% of caregivers by the 1930s and 40s in England, until the laws were changed. Well, what about the United States? Were things any different? Well, unfortunately not. The American Nurses Association, our governing body today, the ANA, when it was conceived by Isabel Hampton Robb and others in 1897, said men will not be allowed as members. Intentional gender bias because of their gender. And men from 1897, from the very beginning of the ANA to 1930, were not allowed to be a member of the American Nurses Association. The ANA used their influence that men who were trained as caregivers could not even serve in the military as caring for wounded soldiers all the way until the Korean War ended. That was in 1955. So Vietnam was the first conflict that men were allowed to serve as nurses in that context. Well, has this legacy 100+ years ago continuing to influence nursing and nursing education today? The answer is unequivocally yes. There's numerous articles in the nursing education literature that really make it clear that that Houston, there continues to be a problem. Let's just look at one article. Chad Olin, one of the most cited and advocates of men in nursing and has done most of the research, says this. He did a gender-based barriers for male students in nursing education about 10 years ago. Said the most frequent barriers. There's no history of the male participation as caregivers in textbooks today. Men felt they had to prove themselves. There was a lack of male faculty to identify and be a role model. And they really felt vulnerable with intimate touch. And men felt not supported by the faculty, who are primarily women. And men have reported qualitatively a distinct bias against anti-male comments that, oh, you're only here to basically be a CRNA and make lots of money after graduation. You really don't want to be a true caregiver. Not true. They also have, men in nursing have a very different experience with OB clinicals. This is still a dicey area, even today, within nursing education. Well, as we look at current nursing textbook bias, what's really interesting is that it's filtered through the lens of a predominantly female profession. And therefore, in one of the most popular fundamental textbooks 10 years ago in their 6th edition, they basically had a men in nursing table. And in this table, it says, what's basically the contributions of when you look at men in nursing? It was non-existent. In fact, it started out with this entry, 300 AD, entry of women into nursing. They got it wrong by 1,000 years and the wrong gender. Now, if a grad student from Minnesota 10 years ago could obtain this information in the nursing literature for my thesis, there's really no excuse that a nationally published prominent textbook of nursing can't get this right. But let's look at another recent literature. In 2008, article titled Warming the Nursing Education Climate for Traditional Age Learners Who Are Male, basically said this, that they observed qualitatively from objective researchers that faculty in general were harsher with men. And men perceived that the words were said were not necessarily what they said, but how it was said. And clearly more of an antagonistic tone towards men versus women. Another finding was this, is that the female faculty spent less time with male students compared to women. And basically, female students felt in general more connected and cared for by the female faculty. What was really interesting at the end of the day in this study is that when the students, both men and women, were asked, say, what was a meaningful experience for you in this clinical setting or in this program? 3/4 of the women students described an experience with the nursing faculty, but the men did not even go there. Every meaningful experience was with patients, not with faculty. Interesting observation. And I think what's interesting though is that men are different than women. We were created male and female. And men in general, this is just how we roll. Some of the things that can antagonize, I think, women faculty is that we're more likely to challenge and confront, not necessarily in a disrespectful manner, but we want to know, why is that the way it is? And do you really know what you're saying? We'll just question it, not to antagonize, but it's perceived that way. And one of the observations in the literature that male students learn very quickly, I can't be a dude in this nursing program. I've got to ramp it down and be more like a woman and just kind of keep my head down so I don't stick out too much. That's a common theme for male students in nursing education yet today. And you know, the consequence of all of these barriers that continue to exist in nursing education is this. The literature supports that male students are your highest and at-risk group to fail or drop out of the nursing program. In one study in England, almost 30% of men dropped out, did not fail to complete would be probably the better term, versus 10% of women. So 3 times higher the statistical presence of not completing. And this has been also validated by statistics in the United States. Up to 40 to 50% of male students fail to complete nursing education programs today. Well, why is there such a high risk for male students? Well, one is the lack of male role models. There's no one to really support male students who do roll a little bit differently and need that identity. In our culture, there's a lot of the stereotypes of being effeminate or homosexual if you're a nurse, which has some feminine connotations to it. That's a barrier. Another consideration is that there's a lack of a knowledge of one's history. When you know your legacy and your history, you basically can kind of embrace it and say, I belong here. But when nursing textbooks today either completely ignore or rewrite the contributions of men in nursing, male students today wonder, do I even belong? And the question is, yes, you do. The end result is that nursing's perceived as a women's profession, and men feel isolated, and at the end of the day are very ambivalent about their choice to be a nurse and are much more likely as a result to drop out. So when we look at why these barriers persist, I think it's important to say, what's interesting is that feminism rails against the machine of patriarchy. But what's interesting about nursing as a profession, it's one of the few professions where matriarchy rules. Women are in power, women are in places of authority, women are in leadership, and therefore, does it affect the minority gender? I think it's something to consider. Also consider the lack of diversity in nursing education. Though men make up 10% of the nursing profession as a whole, in education it's much less, 5%. Therefore, 95% of faculty are women, and basically, it definitely influences the support and the perceptions that the nursing literature does support. And I think it's need to put bias into perspective. When you look at, for example, the 1950s, why were there colored drinking fountains saying white only, colored only, and segregation and the pain of the civil rights movement? Because there was something that happened about 100 years before then called slavery. And slavery puts into context the ongoing bias that many African Americans continue to experience. It hasn't gone away. And I'm not comparing the pain of discrimination and slavery to male experience, but the bias is bias, whether it's racial bias or gender bias. And therefore, I believe that we need to consider that the ongoing bias that was present in nursing and nursing history may influence the present today. I think it's also to consider too, what's really interesting is that when I did my grad thesis for men in nursing, did some statistics, found out when it related to boards of nursing discipline here in Minnesota, over a 15-year period, men made up 6% of the nurses, but 18.2% of all board discipline. That is 3 times the statistical presence. Again, just like male failure to complete rates, very significant and needs to be saying why. What's ironic when I did further research, Minnesota is not the only state with extraordinary rates of discipline towards men in nursing. It's actually throughout, and other studies have validated this. They don't know why though. That has not been researched. So if you're a grad student, this is a topic that needs to be explored. So as we look at closing thoughts, I think we need to acknowledge and make it very clear that men have contributed as caregivers to the nursing profession going back 2,500 years ago. That needs to be known, as well as the bias. We need to acknowledge the bias. Why is this such a skeleton that isn't even in the textbooks? It is unfathomable to me as a male member of the profession. That needs to change. Men do belong. And when we look at the nursing shortage, there's going to need over 1 million nurses in the next several years. Where are we going to get them from? Women have so many options. We need men and ethnic minorities to be actively recruited and retained and supported so that they continue to be a part of the profession. These barriers I've discussed must be broken down, and the time is now. And I want to encourage, whether you're a nursing student, a nurse in practice, or a nurse educator, to support men in nursing and to be the needed change. Thank you.